The night the engines roared outside the Maplewood veterans' home was the night everything changed. The sound was low at first, like distant thunder rolling through the narrow suburban streets, until it swelled into a growl that shook the windows. The nurses whispered nervously, wondering why a dozen motorcycles were pulling up in the middle of the night. No one knew that inside room 12B, under the dim flicker of a bedside lamp, a frail old man with silver hair and a chest full of faded medals was wide awake, gripping the photograph of his old army unit as if it were the last piece of his soul. His name was Walt Henderson, 97 years old, a World War II paratrooper, a man who had seen death and courage in equal measure. But tonight, for reasons no one yet understood, a group of leather-clad bikers had come for him. If you believe that kindness, loyalty, and second chances can still change lives, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe. This story will remind you that the strongest bonds can form in the most unexpected ways. Walt had been living in Maplewood for nearly 3 years. His wife Helen had passed a decade earlier, and his only daughter lived across the country. Most days were quiet, too quiet. His world had shrunk to a single hallway and a window overlooking a parking lot where no one ever parked for him. He spent hours staring out, remembering the laughter of his comrades and the chaos of the skies over Europe. His medals were neatly pinned to his chest each morning by Nurse Clara, who often joked that Walt was the most decorated man in the building. But even Clara couldn't fill the emptiness that had taken root in him, that quiet ache of being forgotten by the world he once fought for. Then, one cold autumn evening, everything changed. The sound of those bikes broke through the sterile silence. Within minutes, 6 men in heavy leather jackets pushed through the front door. Their vests bore a name that sent a ripple of unease. Through the staff, Hell's Angels. They moved with purpose, like men on a mission. The head nurse stepped forward, trying to protest, but their leader, a tall, broad man with weathered hands and tired eyes, simply said, "We're here for Walter Henderson." No one dared stop them. The men marched down the hallway, boots echoing on the tile, until they reached Walt's room. The old veteran looked up, confusion flashing in his weary eyes as 2 of the bikers knelt beside his wheelchair. "Come on, old-timer," one of them muttered softly. "We're taking you out." For a moment, everyone assumed it was a kidnapping, but what came next turned that assumption upside down. The bikers lifted Walt gently, careful not to jar his fragile frame. As they carried him through the hallway, the nurses froze, not because they were afraid, but because of what they heard. Walt was laughing, the deep, raspy laugh of a man who hadn't felt alive in years. "Took you long enough," he said through a smile that stunned everyone watching. They strapped him securely in a sidecar attached to one of the motorcycles, wrapped him in a leather jacket, and roared off into the night. The nursing home staff called the police, reporting a possible abduction, but by the time the officers arrived, the bikes were long gone, vanishing into the darkness like ghosts from another time. The next morning, Walt's daughter received a call that left her speechless. Her father was safe, more than safe. He was in the company of a motorcycle club that had once shared a bond with him stronger than blood. The truth, as it turned out, was far more powerful than any crime story. Decades earlier, Walt had led a squad of young soldiers through the ruins of Europe. One of those men, a wiry 19-year-old mechanic named Ray, had survived the war thanks to Walt's courage. Walt had pulled him from a burning vehicle under heavy fire, saving his life. When Ray returned home, he struggled with civilian life, eventually finding family, among a group of bikers who valued loyalty above all else. That group became the Hells Angels chapter that had come for Walt that night. Ray had never forgotten his commanding officer. For years, he'd tried to track him down, but records were lost, and time moved on. Then one day, a local veteran volunteer recognized Walt's name from an old patch photo and made a call. When Ray learned that the man who had once carried him through the smoke of war was now sitting alone in a nursing home, his heart broke. "He saved my life," Ray had told his brothers. "Now we're going to give him his back." The following weeks became something extraordinary. Walt, now living among the bikers, was transformed. They took him on rides across the countryside, letting the wind rush through his thinning white hair. They brought him to veteran reunions, parades, and diners where people stood and applauded when they learned who he was. They called him Colonel even though he'd retired as a captain, and they treated him like royalty. Walt hadn't smiled this much since 1945. He became the soul of their group, the quiet voice of reason when tempers flared, the storyteller who kept the young members grounded. Around campfires, he'd speak of bravery, loss, and the meaning of brotherhood, his wrinkled hands trembling as he held a mug of coffee. The bikers listened in reverent silence, often wiping tears from their tattooed faces. In return, they made sure he never felt alone again. They built him a small cabin on Ray's property, decorated it with his medals, and parked his favorite Harley out front, a bike they'd rebuilt just for him. But as the months passed, Walt's health began to decline. His body, already frail, couldn't keep up with the rugged life he once adored. Yet, he refused to go back to the nursing home. "I started my life surrounded by brothers," he said one morning, "and I want to finish it the same way." The bikers understood. They cared for him around the clock, taking turns, sitting by his bedside, telling stories, and playing his favorite swing records. On a crisp evening in late spring, as the sun dipped below the hills, Walt asked Ray to take him for one last ride. They placed him carefully in the sidecar, bundled him in a thick blanket, and set off down an empty highway lined with golden fields. The rumble of the engine echoed through the air, steady and strong, as if carrying the heartbeat of a man who had lived 100 lifetimes. Walt looked up at the sky, his lips curving into a faint smile. "It's beautiful," he whispered. That was his last ride. When they returned, Walt was gone, peaceful, eyes closed, hand resting on the small American flag Ray had placed in his lap. The men stood silently for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the cooling engine. Tough men who had lived hard lives wept openly that night. They buried Walt with full military honors, his coffin draped in the flag he'd fought for, his medals shining under the sun. Hundreds came, veterans, bikers, strangers who had read about his story online. Ray placed Walt's rebuilt Harley beside his grave, its engine polished and silent. "You gave me my life," he murmured. "Now you've got your freedom back." From that day forward, the Hells Angels rode with a patch stitched to their vests, a small, simple design that read, "Ride for Walt." It became their symbol of loyalty, brotherhood, and redemption. The story spread far and wide. News outlets framed it as a kidnapping that turned into a rescue, but those who knew the truth understood it was more than that. It was about a promise kept, a reminder that the bonds forged in struggle never truly fade. It was about men who the world often judged harshly, proving that beneath the leather and noise, there could be more compassion than most people ever show. And for those who visited the old veteran's grave, they'd sometimes find a fresh motorcycle helmet placed beside it, its visor glinting in the sunlight. No one ever saw who left them, but everyone knew why. It was the biker's silent salute, a way of saying, "We ride on, brother." Even years later, new recruits to the club would hear the story of Walt, the 97-year-old veteran who once fought a war and later found peace among men society misunderstood. And every time they hit the open road, someone would rev their engine twice before takeoff, the signal that Walt's spirit was with them, watching over every ride. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that love, loyalty, and redemption still exist in this world, please like, share, and subscribe. Stories like these deserve to be remembered, not for their shock, but for their soul. Before you go, tell us in the comments, would you have done what the bikers did for Walt? Because sometimes the greatest rescues don't happen in war. They happen when someone remembers that every soul, no matter how old or forgotten, deserves one last ride home.